Thank you very much, and thank you to Memo for inviting me. I have to say that this is the culmination of an extremely emotional experience. Basically, my colleague Sandeep Sen and I have been trying very hard to look into the consequences of Oslo on the people that are still living in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And so what I'm trying to do today in the first couple of minutes that I have is to basically try and humanize all those who are on the receiving end of the consequences of Oslo. And secondly, to try and share with you how all the people that are involved in this theatrics are actually entrapped in the so-called Zionist script. So I'm very much following up with Professor Ilan Pape's work. So taking into consideration the background about settler colonialism, I just want to share with you a starting interview with a very famous Palestinian activist who had a very luxurious life in the States, but deemed it upon herself to go back to the West Bank to try and change things from the ground. And as someone who is getting of age, my only hope remains in the young generation. So I'll start with a little interview we had with her. So when we came to do our fieldwork and our ethnographic observations, a lot of our Palestinian interviewees were asking the question, but why are you so interested in the PA? Why are you not interested in the Israeli occupation? And so we had to kind of make the argument that by looking at the PA, we were using this as a pretext for highlighting another avenue when the Palestinian national struggle is undermined by Israel's settler colonial enterprise. And as I said, with her particular background and involvement in Palestinian activist circles, this acquaintance of ours shared with us the mutual disdain for the manner in which the state-building agenda has taken center stage in the rhetoric of the international donor community in the occupied West Bank. So we decided to ask her a very specific question, and it was a very personal one. And we started by asking, so how have you experienced the Palestinian Authority in your everyday life since you came to the West Bank? And her response was, ironically these days, we never encounter the Israeli occupation, we encounter the PA. Sometimes it is very frustrating. One time I just lost it. I sat in the middle of the road and started crying. I yelled at our Palestinian policemen, why are you doing this to us? You are our brothers. Surely, we said, they understand, the Palestinian Authority officials, that they are standing in between you and the occupation, both literally and figuratively. And her answer was this: well, many have resigned to this fate. We as a generation are stuck with the Palestinian Authority. We feel absolutely no attachment to it. It does nothing for us, but it is there. It is there because for our parents' generation, it is some sort of an achievement, because eventually they thought this would lead to the real state. They can see today that the Palestinian Authority has failed, but they are helpless and they have become passive now. They have given up. Many of them are now high-ranking members of the PA, but they treat it simply like a job and continue like pre-programmed robots. So there are a multitude of ways in which Palestinian rights and aspirations have been denied by Israel's settler colonialism. But our interviewee's characterization reminds us that while the state, in its sovereign form, is often considered the foundational aspiration of the Palestinian national struggle, the imagined state also serves as a pretext for subverting Palestinian lives in the occupied Palestinian territory. That is to say, the Oslo Accords have purportedly established the PA as a mechanism for Palestinian self-governance, may have been celebrated as the first step towards a Palestinian state. However, these accords only further relegated diaspora Palestinians to permanent exile or refugee status. And as was the case with our interviewee's parents' generation, the PA has thus far only served to undermine the Palestinian national liberation movement by robbing it of the impetus to continue struggling for the national cause. For us, the irony and tragedy here is that to this day, the PA has persisted as an institution that both acts like a state and one that concurrently undermines the Palestinian struggle for sovereign statehood. As it is then often theatrically performs two functions, We explore in our book, which is forthcoming in January, the manner in which its performative acts affect and shape the lives and subjective identities of those in its vicinity in the occupied West Bank. And we'll be following up this work as well in the case of Gaza. So I'll just briefly take you through some of the reflections that I would like to share with you. First of all, I think we all experience a lot of venues like this, a lot of discussions. And one of the key concerns that I have is, so what? What do we do when we all leave and go to our separate homes and our separate lives back again at work on Monday? So the big question I have is for academia in particular, but for those of you who are representing the policymaking community, I think we need to get out of our bubbles and also try and do something about this, which seriously takes into account the rights of the Palestinians. So basically, one of the problematique we try to highlight is that both in academia, but even in the policymaking community, the notion of the state is inherently a violent one. We have the Westphalian system, where to be a state means that you have control over your borders, and how you actually perform that violence and that control is not necessarily something that is taken seriously when violations are occurring at a very a basic human rights level. So I think we need to reinstate some core reflections about this. And secondly, I think we are confronted with a tragedy in Palestine. If you look at the situation of Gaza, the World Bank report has just published its most recent report, where we have actually people living on a life-saving machine. And to the consciousness of the international community, I think this says something, that no matter what happens, no matter how many children are dying of purely no access to food or clean water, the script just continues as is. And I'm very sad to still hear people this morning talking about the two-state solution, a confederation. I don't think this is the kind of reflections that we need to make here. So let me just tell you how we came to this kind of thinking. First of all, when interviewing people in Brussels in particular, but also in the Quartet office in East Jerusalem and other international representative offices in Ramallah, including the Canadians, amongst many Europeans, but particularly the Norwegians, something that I felt at a very individual level is that these people who are given the role to perform the international script of the two-state solution are extremely frustrated, and nobody's looking into what it means for a Norwegian official to actually go to his office every day and see that he has the luxury to get through a checkpoint, whereas Palestinians who live there and who don't have this luxury of just going there for 3 years and leaving behind don't actually experience this kind of luxury. And this does something to the individual at stake. So what we see at the international community level discourse is very different from that played out when you speak to these individuals who are actually trying to do a job. And a very sort of metaphoric example of this is my interview with a Norwegian official who basically, when I presented our project, his desk was full of paperwork, and he just literally just wiped everything out of his desk, and he said, "Finally, I can be myself." And this kind of anxiety-ridden performance of these internationals was something that we saw across the board. So there is an inherent sub-society, so to say, that is dying to do something different, but doesn't have the alternative to do so. And this is what we also experienced amongst Palestinian Authority functionaries. And this was very telling for us. Many of them work for the PA because it's the only way they can bring food on the table to their families. Yet they are very recognizing and very cognizant of the fact that their participation in the PA will never bring the Palestinians true liberation. So it is a kind of existential mode of being. They exist, but they don't really live. And this was a very painful experience to witness, particularly when these functionaries simply broke down, in spite of all the representation of the symbols of the state, coming into the Interior Ministry in Ramallah. The state of Palestine is very clearly represented in the buildings, in the photos of Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, etc., the kind of uniforms they are given by the internationals, the kind of tools that were mentioned by Allah in order to perform the functions of a Westphalian state, in order to keep control over their people. And this has a social psychological effect on these people, and this is what we're trying to bring to the fore with our book. Another entrapped group of people is those people who work for so-called Palestinian NGOs. You probably all know that we've already been through this stage where a lot of Palestinians realize that if they're going to continue to accept money and funding from the international community, then they will be subject to their agendas. So the new trend now is to try and ask Palestinian experts to fund their activities at the civil society level. And yet they remain entrapped in this notion of what are we actually fighting for? What is there at the end of this road, right? So it was, again, quite an anxiety-ridden performance of these political subjects that on the one hand are trying to fight for a national struggle, on the other hand knowing that they have very limited political power to do so. And finally, because I was asked to keep my time very short for discussion, I think the most disturbing ethnographic work we did was with political prisoners who were actually tortured by the PA. And we've heard a lot of stories of how PA officers were actually former prisoners in Israeli prisons, but also how they were trained in torture techniques by the Israelis themselves. And yet the torture that Palestinian political prisoners experience in PA prisons, including the infamous one in Jericho, which we visited, are actually tougher than the torture techniques that have been experienced in Israeli jails. And the kind of breakdown in the mental health of these people is that they cannot accept that it is their own sometimes cousin, it's their uncle, who is actually performing this act of violence on themselves. And when they basically try to look each other in the eyes, they can see this kind of contradiction of how they are being subjects in a state that will never be, right? So this is what I'm trying to call for, that we need to take into account that there are some serious psychological impacts on the people that are actually living the proceeds of Oslo. So I'll try to finish with a little bit of hope. For us, the question remains, what is then the path forward? Indeed, it would seem that the search for the state, operationalized under the auspices of state-building mechanisms, whether in Palestine or beyond, operates under the assumption that state-building is the sole path forward. After all, if not state-building, what else? Such an assumption draws on the conception of the state as key to keeping disorder at bay. Specifically in Palestine, where the overarching political context is defined by a Palestinian liberation struggle that strives to dismantle the Israeli occupation, there may, however, just be an opportunity to rethink the manner in which the state, and not Palestinian rights and aspirations, has animated the international community's engagement with Palestine. This is not to argue that the state should entirely be expunged from our focus when deliberating Israel and Palestine. However, it is important to consider the state from the perspective of the Palestinian national struggle as simply the final institutional manifestation of the securement of Palestinian sovereign rights and national aspirations. In this sense, our focus needs to be sustained on the securement of these rights and aspirations. That is, a clear focus that is primarily concerned with justice for Palestinians. In effect, this would mean that local and international stakeholders would need to dispel of the understanding of state building as a means of preventing Palestinian life from devolving into anarchy. Instead, stakeholders must assess the extent to which their investments in the occupied Palestinian territories are in the service of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. We argue that in Palestine, the PA and its statecraft had become the Rome that leads to. The tragedy that unfolded in our work shows that Rome does not actually exist at the end of these roads. We sustain that, therefore, Palestinians' right to have rights and their liberation from settler colonialism can become that missing Rome. Finally, investments, whether monetary or political, should be focused on enabling the road that would lead to the securement of Palestinian rights and aspirations and counter the politics, that is Israel's settler colonialism, that has thus far ensured Palestinian statelessness. Thank you.
Thank you very much.